When I walked into that boardroom, I wasn't expecting a promotion, I was expecting fairness. Instead, they gave me their pity wrapped in condescension. You don't have what it takes for executive leadership. You're not executive material. 3 months later, I closed my Series A funding round at $110 million. They were right about one thing. I wasn't meant to be their executive, I was meant to be their competition. My name is Chloe Lancaster. And at 35, I'd spent 7 years building Sterling Dynamics' clean energy division from a side project into their most profitable vertical. The Denver skyline stretched behind me through the floor-to-ceiling windows as I prepared my presentation that morning, unaware it would be my last real contribution to the company that had consumed my 30s. I'd arrived at Sterling when they were still operating out of a converted warehouse, back when clean tech was considered a risky bet. While others chased quick wins in traditional energy markets, I mapped out expansion strategies that would eventually capture 40% of the Southwest's renewable infrastructure contracts. My frameworks, my late nights, my relationships painstakingly built over countless conferences and calls. But that October morning, standing before the executive board with my federal market penetration strategy, I watched their eyes glaze over. Not with boredom, I'd seen that before. This was different. This was dismissal. Predetermined and absolute. Interesting approach. Chloe, David Hanley, our CEO, interrupted halfway through my cost projections. But perhaps too ambitious for our current capabilities. Too ambitious. I'd heard those words before, always directed at women who dared think beyond their designated boxes. My strategy would have positioned Sterling as the primary clean energy contractor for federal facilities across 12 states. The numbers were conservative. The partnerships already soft committed. We think Evan should take point on federal markets, David continued, nodding toward Evan Rusk, who'd joined 8 months ago from a failed solar startup. He has the right presence for those relationships. Presence, not experience, not track record, not the methodical relationship building I'd invested 3 years into. Presence, after the meeting, Linda Chen, our CFO and the only other woman in senior leadership, pulled me aside. Her expression mixed sympathy with resignation, a look I'd seen her perfect over the years. Chloe, you do excellent work, she said, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. But you're not executive material. You lack a certain gravitas. Gravitas. Another word from their coded vocabulary, like culture fit and leadership presence, phrases that somehow never applied to anyone who looked like me. I stood there in my perfectly pressed suit, holding the tablet containing 5 years of strategic innovations, and felt something shift. Not break. I was too seasoned for dramatic shatter. This was quieter, like tectonic plates sliding apart deep underground. They'd made their decision about my ceiling long before I'd entered that room. 3 hours later, I watched Evan sketch my federal strategy on a whiteboard, claiming inspiration struck during his morning run. The other executives nodded appreciatively at his vision, his boldness, his executive presence. I didn't argue. I didn't correct the record. I simply opened my desk drawer and looked at the other strategies I'd developed, the ones I'd never bothered to submit through official channels, because I'd learned that certain ideas needed certain faces to succeed. That night, I updated my LinkedIn quietly. Not bitter, not angry. Just ready. They were right about one thing. I wasn't executive material. Not for them. The isolation began subtly, like morning frost creeping across glass. First, I noticed my email address dropping from strategic planning threads. Must have been an oversight. Sarah from operations apologized when I asked, but oversights don't happen 5 times in 2 weeks. Then came the meeting invitations that arrived late, or not at all. I'd walk past conference room A and see the entire leadership team huddled around spreadsheets I'd created, discussing implementations I'd designed, while I sat at my desk updating reports no one would read. Evan had taken to scheduling federal strategy syncs at 7 a.m., knowing I lived 40 minutes outside Denver. When I managed to attend, He'd spend the first 20 minutes discussing his weekend marathons or his thoughts on market disruption. Performative intellectualism designed to establish dominance. My contributions were met with polite nods and redirections. Interesting point, Chloe, he'd say, already turning to address someone else. But let's think bigger picture here. The bigger picture. My picture. The one I'd painted in painstaking detail over 3 years of relationship building and market analysis. Now it was being finger-painted over by someone who couldn't distinguish between a federal RFP and a grant application 6 months ago. The Wednesday that broke my last professional courtesy started like any other. I'd arrived early to prepare for the quarterly board review, only to find my access to the shared drive mysteriously restricted. It claimed it was a permissions update. By the time they fixed it, Evan had already presented my Southwest expansion analysis as his own breakthrough innovation. But the public humiliation came during the all-hands that afternoon. We were discussing Q4 resource allocation when I suggested dedicating a team to small municipal contracts, a strategy that had yielded 30% of our previous year's growth. Evan actually laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a performative sound designed to carry across the room. Chloe's still thinking small ball, he announced to the 60 people on the call. This is why we need fresh perspectives in strategic planning. No offense, but some people are better suited to execution than vision. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see sympathy flashing across faces in the video gallery, junior analysts who'd worked with me, engineers who'd implemented my designs. But sympathy doesn't challenge power structures. It just makes everyone feel better about maintaining them. Linda, ever the diplomat, quickly pivoted the conversation. But damage done is damage recorded. In corporate America, public diminishment is a death sentence written in invisible ink. I spent that evening in my home office, staring at 5 years of work, strategies that had generated millions in revenue, partnerships I'd cultivated from cold calls to million-dollar contracts, innovation frameworks that Sterling now claimed as part of their organizational DNA. My resignation letter was brief, professional, hollow as a bell no one would ring. But before I submitted it, I did something else. I opened my personal drive and began transferring files. Not proprietary data or client information. I wasn't interested in lawsuits or burning bridges. These were different documents. The strategies deemed too ambitious. The market analyses labeled not aligned with company direction. The innovation proposals that had been buried in bureaucracy because they hadn't come from someone with executive presence. Sterling's legal department had been meticulous about intellectual property regarding implemented strategies, but these orphaned ideas that had been formally rejected or ignored, they existed in a gray zone that their lawyers hadn't thought to address. After all, why would anyone want the ideas Sterling Dynamics had thrown away? I submitted my resignation on a Thursday afternoon, effective in 2 weeks. David's response was predictably magnanimous, praising my contributions while accepting my decision to pursue other opportunities. Evan sent a one-line email hoping we could stay connected. My final day was orchestrated theater, a cake in the break room, hollow speeches about my valuable contributions. Evan made a point of publicly thanking me for laying the groundwork he could build upon. I smiled, shook hands, and carried my single box of personal items to my car. As I drove away from Sterling's glass campus, I didn't feel the rage I'd expected. No tears, no fury, no desperate need to scream at the indifferent Colorado sky. Instead, there was something else. A crystalline clarity that comes when you finally see the game board from above instead of as a piece being moved across it. They'd pushed me out, yes, but in doing so, they'd also freed me from their limitations, their narrow vision of what I could be. They thought they were closing a door. They were actually opening a universe. Bend. Oregon welcomed me with the kind of silence Denver never offered. My cousin Maya, an architect specializing in sustainable construction, had converted her garage into a studio apartment that became my sanctuary. For the first week, I did nothing but sleep, hike the Deschutes River Trail, and let my nervous system remember what it felt like to exist without constant performance anxiety. You know what you're doing, right? Maya asked one evening, watching me spread blueprints across her dining table. Not Sterling's blueprints, mine. The ones that had lived in my laptop's forgotten folders, marked declined or revisit later, or simply too much. I'm thinking, I replied, which was both true and wildly incomplete. What I was actually doing was reimagining everything. Sterling's model relied on massive infrastructure, lengthy implementation cycles, and the kind of bureaucratic inefficiency that made government contracts profitable but progress glacial. My discarded proposals had always pushed towards something different: modular systems, rapid deployment, energy solutions that could scale down as elegantly as they scaled up. 4 months. That's what I gave myself. 4 months of 12-hour days fueled by Maya's coffee and the kind of focused rage that only comes from being professionally gaslit. I rebuilt every strategy from first principles, stripping away Sterling's bloated processes and corporate ego. What emerged was lean, aggressive, and designed for the world that was coming, not the one Sterling was comfortable in. The framework was deceptively simple: distributed clean energy systems using AI-driven load balancing, deployable in weeks instead of months, profitable at scales Sterling wouldn't touch. Small industrial parks, growing manufacturing districts, rural hospitals, the overlooked markets that Sterling deemed not worth the effort. My savings account held $340,000, 7 years of living below my means while Sterling's executives bought Teslas and vacation homes. It would have been enough for a comfortable sabbatical, a chance to find myself or whatever people do when they're pushed out of careers they'd bled for. Instead, I incorporated TerraCore Labs on a Tuesday afternoon, using Oregon's business-friendly laws and Maya's address. The name came to me during a morning run. Terra for Earth, Core for Fundamental. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would ping on Sterling's competitive radar. Finding my first investor took 3 weeks and one carefully orchestrated introduction. Renata Adamson ran a women-led venture fund out of Portland, someone I'd met briefly at a conference where she'd been the only presenter not wearing a suit. My former Sterling colleague, Priya, made the connection with a simple email. "You two should talk." Renata reviewed my proposal over Vietnamese coffee in a Portland cafe that felt worlds away from Sterling's sterile conference rooms. "They really passed on this?" she asked after 2 hours of increasingly pointed questions. "They said it lacked scope," I replied. "Too fragmented, too risky." She laughed, not Evan's performative bark, but genuine amusement. "Men always think bigger means better. We're funding at $2.5 million with an option for Series A if you hit milestones." My first 3 hires were deliberate. Carmen, a systems engineer who'd been passed over for promotion at Tesla 3 times. Aisha, a supply chain expert who'd quit Siemens after her maternity leave mysteriously coincided with a restructuring. And Jade, a sales strategist who'd built relationships across the Southwest while being paid 60% of her male counterparts. We worked out of a converted warehouse in Ben's industrial district. No ping-pong tables, no kombucha on tap, no motivational posters about disruption. Just 4 women who'd been told they weren't executive material. Building something our former employers couldn't imagine. The first prototype took 6 weeks. Carmen had it running in a parking lot, powering a small office building with solar panels and battery storage that could be installed in 3 days versus Sterling's 3 months. Aisha found suppliers who could deliver components at 40% below Sterling's costs because we weren't demanding exclusive contracts and Byzantine approval processes. Jade started making calls to her network, the plant managers and facilities directors who actually made decisions, not the C-suite executives Sterling courted with golf outings. We signed our first pilot contract with a textile factory in New Mexico, then a medical complex in Arizona, a data center in rural Texas. Small deals by Sterling standards, none over $2 million. But our implementation time was weeks, not quarters. Our systems paid for themselves in 18 months, not 5 years. I kept TerraCore off LinkedIn, off industry news sites, off any radar that might alert Sterling to what was building in Oregon's high desert. We were still too small, too fragile for direct confrontation. But with each successful installation, each satisfied customer, each system that performed beyond projections, I felt the foundation settling beneath us. Not revenge, not yet, just preparation. Sterling thought they'd eliminated a problem employee. Instead, they'd created a competitor who knew every weakness in their armor. And I was just getting started. The text message arrived while I was reviewing installation reports from our El Paso deployment. Holy shit, Chloe. Sterling just lost the Tucson municipal contract. Client cited, seeking more agile solutions. That's you, isn't it? Priya, still my eyes and ears inside Sterling despite my departure, had an uncanny ability to connect dots. I didn't respond directly, but I did smile at my laptop screen. The Tucson contract was worth $8 million, pocket change for Sterling. But symbolic. They'd held that relationship for 6 years. TerraCore had underbid them by 30% and promised implementation in 6 weeks versus their projected 6 months. We delivered in 5. The beauty of our model was its invisibility to Sterling's traditional metrics. We weren't competing for the $100 million federal contracts that made headlines. We were nibbling at the edges: industrial parks, regional hospitals, mid-sized manufacturing facilities, death by 1,000 paper cuts, each too small to warrant Sterling's attention until the bleeding became impossible to ignore. Carmen had evolved our AI-driven load balancing system to the point where it could predict and adjust energy distribution patterns 3 days in advance. Aisha's supply chain ran so efficiently, we could guarantee delivery windows in days, not weeks. Jade had built a referral network that functioned like a whisper campaign across the Southwest Industrial Corridor. We need to hire, Jade announced during our weekly standing meeting. We refuse to call them scrums. I've got 17 active negotiations and 3 more RFPs coming this week. Our second funding round closed at $190 million, led by Kieran Walsh at Meridian Ventures. I'd initially ignored his emails, remembering how he'd passed on my proposals twice while I was at Sterling. But Jade convinced me to take the meeting. I was wrong, Kieran said within 5 minutes of sitting down. No preamble, no excuses. I looked at your Sterling presentations after you left. We should have backed you then. You backed Evan instead, I reminded him. How's that working out? His grimace was answer enough. Evan's federal initiative had burned through $20 million with exactly 2 contracts to show for it, both inherited from my groundwork. We closed the round in 3 weeks. I kept our valuation conservative, more interested in smart money than big numbers. Every investor who'd rejected me at Sterling now wanted in. I took particular satisfaction in declining David Hanley's former golf buddy, who suddenly discovered our innovative approach to distributed energy solutions. The real shift came when Bloomberg picked up our story, not through any PR push from us, but because a journalist noticed Sterling's earnings call mentioned increased competition in secondary markets. They'd tried to bury the concern in corporate speak, but analysts started asking questions. TerraCore's name appeared in the article's final paragraph, almost as an afterthought. But that was enough to trigger a cascade of interest. My phone started ringing with numbers I recognized: Sterling clients, Sterling partners, Sterling employees. Carmen looked up from her monitors one afternoon, grinning. Guess who just posted a job rec for an AI integration specialist for energy systems? Sterling. They're trying to build what we've already deployed to 40 sites. I pulled up Sterling's stock price, down 12% over the quarter. They'd missed earnings projections for the first time in 5 years, citing temporary market adjustments and strategic realignment initiatives. Corporate speak for panic. Maya visited our new offices in Bend. We'd taken over the entire warehouse plus the building next door. She walked through our operations center, past the desks of our now 50-person team, and stopped at the wall where we'd mounted a map marking every TerraCore installation. Remember when you were sleeping 14 hours a day? She asked. Recovering, I corrected. Not sleeping. Recovering. From what? I thought about it. From gaslighting. From being told my ideas were too ambitious while watching mediocre men fail upward with worse versions of my strategies. From 7 years of making myself smaller to fit in boxes designed by people who couldn't see past their own reflections. From believing them, I finally said. The sweetest vindication came in an unexpected form. Resumes. Sterling employees, good ones, the kind I'd tried to protect during my tenure, started reaching out. Not directly at first, just testing waters through mutual connections. Could TerraCore use a senior project manager? What about a systems architect with federal clearance? I hired selectively, taking only those who'd shown kindness when it cost them nothing and competence when no one was watching. Each new hire was another crack in Sterling's foundation. Another reminder that culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Evan lasted another quarter before being quietly reassigned to special projects. His replacement was someone I'd never heard of, brought in from outside to reinvigorate federal partnerships. I wished them luck. They'd need it. Sterling was hemorrhaging talent and contracts while we were building tomorrow's infrastructure today. They still had size, legacy, and deep pockets. But we had something more valuable: the ability to move fast and break things, specifically their monopoly on mediocrity. The war was far from over. But for the first time in my career, I was playing offense instead of defense, and I was winning. The call came through my assistant. Yes, I had an assistant now. And Malik was worth every penny of his salary for his ability to filter out the noise. Chloe, Sterling's legal team wants to schedule a meeting. They're calling it a strategic partnership discussion. I was reviewing expansion plans for our Michigan facilities when he interrupted. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sterling wanted to talk partnership while we were actively recruiting their top thermal dynamics engineer. Tell them I'm unavailable, I started, then reconsidered. Actually, ask if David Hanley will be attending personally. If not, I'm not interested. 2 hours later, Malik knocked again. They said Mr. Hanley would be delighted to meet with you. Delighted. I wondered if David had choked on that word. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a law firm's conference room in downtown Denver. I brought Jade and our general counsel. They brought an army, David, their new chief strategy officer, 2 lawyers, and someone from corporate development who kept checking his phone like he'd rather be anywhere else. David had aged noticeably in the 18 months since I'd cleaned out my desk. His golf tan couldn't hide the stress lines, and his trademark confidence seemed forced, like a suit that no longer fit properly. Chloe, he opened with his best patriarch smile. You've built something impressive. We should be working together, not against each other. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, a negotiation tactic I'd learned watching him, actually. We're not working against anyone, I finally responded. We're serving markets Sterling chose to ignore. Markets we're now interested in, their strategy officer interjected. There's room for collaboration. Jade slid a tablet across the table. Funny thing about Sterling's sudden interest in distributed systems, this is a patent filing from last week. Looks remarkably similar to our proprietary load balancing algorithm. Their lawyers shifted uncomfortably. They'd been sloppy, trying to reverse engineer our technology from public installations. The patent wouldn't hold up. Carmen had made sure our IP protection was bulletproof, but the attempt was telling. What do you want? David dropped the pretense. Acquisition? We're prepared to make a substantial offer. I'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times, but reality felt different. Across the table sat the man who'd told me I wasn't executive material, now asking to buy what I'd built from the ashes of his rejection. Sterling's current market cap is $2.3 billion, I said. TerraCore's last valuation was $1.5 billion and climbing. Why would I sell my future to prop up your past? Their corporate development guy stopped checking his phone. David leaned forward, trying to recapture his intimidation factor. You're playing in the minor leagues, Chloe. We have government relationships you can't imagine, resources you can't match. Had, I corrected. You had those relationships. How's the Federal Energy Efficiency Initiative going, by the way? Still struggling to deliver on the contracts Evan promised? The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. They knew I knew. Sterling's federal program was hemorrhaging money and credibility, while TerraCore had quietly secured preferred vendor status with 3 government agencies through consistent delivery and transparent pricing. This is business. David tried one last angle. Not personal. We could make you very wealthy. I stood, gathering my things with deliberate calm. I'm already wealthy, David. The difference is I earned it by building something, not by tearing others down. Jade and our counsel followed my lead. At the door, I turned back to face the room full of men who'd once decided my fate in my absence. Oh, and David, that strategic partnership discussion you wanted? Here's my counteroffer. Stay out of our way. And we'll continue to pretend Sterling is still relevant in distributed energy. Start a war with us, and I'll make sure everyone knows why your best talent keeps jumping ship. The aftermath was swift and predictable. Evan appeared on CNBC's Market Makers 2 days later, delivering a prepared statement about inexperienced players flooding the market with untested solutions. He looked rehearsed and desperate, especially when the host asked him to explain why Sterling's stock had dropped 18% year over year while these inexperienced players were signing record contracts. I didn't watch the full interview. Malik summarized it while I reviewed our latest deployment reports. We'd just crossed into profitability 6 months ahead of schedule. Our team had grown to 127 people across 4 states. And Sterling? They'd announced their third restructuring initiative in 12 months. The real victory wasn't in Sterling's stumbles, though. It was in the text message from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Lancaster. I'm a junior analyst at Sterling. They just killed another innovative project because it doesn't align with corporate strategy. I've heard TerraCore actually listens to good ideas. Are you hiring? We were. We always were for people who'd been told their ideas were too ambitious, their vision too broad, their presence not quite executive material. Because Sterling was right about one thing. I wasn't built for their world, I was built to replace it. The National Energy Innovation Summit wasn't just another conference, it was the industry's Super Bowl, where deals were made and reputations cemented. For 3 years running, Sterling had delivered the keynote. This year, they weren't even invited to the main stage. I was. Standing backstage at the Phoenix Convention Center, I could hear 4,000 industry leaders finding their seats. My hands were steady, steadier than they'd been during any Sterling presentation. Carmen stood beside me, tablet in hand, triple-checking our demonstration setup. Their CEO just walked in, she whispered, front row, trying to look unbothered. I smiled. Good. I want him to have a clear view. The introduction felt like vindication wrapped in professional courtesy. Please welcome Chloe Lancaster, CEO of TerraCore Labs, whose distributed energy systems are revolutionizing how we think about industrial power infrastructure. The applause was genuine. Half our audience were current or potential customers. The other half were competitors scrambling to understand how we'd grown so fast. I spotted at least a dozen Sterling executives scattered throughout the auditorium, including Evan in the 5th row, his face carefully neutral. 3 years ago, I began, letting my voice carry across the vast space. I proposed a radical idea to my former employer. What if we stopped thinking about energy infrastructure as monolithic systems and started building networks that could adapt, scale, and evolve with their communities? The first slide appeared behind me, not a PowerPoint template, but real-time data from our 200-plus active installations, showing energy flow, cost savings, and carbon reduction in living color. I was told this vision was too fragmented, too ambitious, too risky. I paused, making eye contact with David in the front row. Today, TerraCore's fragmented approach powers manufacturing facilities across 14 states, reducing implementation time by 70% and costs by 45%. The audience leaned forward as I walked them through TerraCore V3, our latest innovation that integrated predictive AI with renewable sources and traditional grid connections. Carmen triggered the live demonstration, showing real-time switching between power sources based on demand, weather, and pricing. But the real innovation, I continued, isn't in our technology, it's in our philosophy. While others chase $100 million contracts that take years to implement, we're powering the forgotten middle, the businesses too small for traditional infrastructure giants to notice, but too important for America's economy to ignore. Then came the moment I debated including until that morning. Behind me, an email appeared on screen, dated 3 years ago, from Sterling's internal communications. My original proposal, marked declined, lacks strategic vision in red letters across the top. A murmur rippled through the audience. In the front row, David's face had turned an interesting shade of purple. This rejection became my business plan, I said simply, because sometimes the best ideas are the ones that don't fit in yesterday's boxes. The demonstration continued. Live feeds from hospitals that hadn't lost power during grid failures, factories that had cut energy costs in half, data centers running carbon neutral without sacrificing performance. Each success story was a client Sterling had overlooked or abandoned. TerraCore isn't just about distributed energy. I moved toward my conclusion. It's about distributed opportunity. It's proof that innovation doesn't always come from the biggest offices or the loudest voices. Sometimes it comes from the people you underestimate. The standing ovation started in the back, where the engineers and project managers sat, and rolled forward like a wave. By the time it reached the front rows, even Sterling's executives had no choice but to rise and clap or look petty in front of their peers. I stayed on stage for questions, fielding technical queries and partnership inquiries with equal ease. The final question came from a journalist I recognized from the Wall Street Journal. Ms. Lancaster, Sterling Dynamics has suggested that TerraCore's rapid growth is unsustainable, that you're sacrificing safety for speed. How do you respond? I smiled, having expected this planted question. Our safety record is public, 0 critical failures across 200-plus installations. As for sustainability, we just signed a $1.5 billion contract with the Department of Energy to retrofit federal facilities across the Southwest. I'll let our partners at the DOE speak to their confidence in our approach. The gasp from the audience was audible. We'd kept the federal contract quiet until this moment, waiting for maximum impact. In the front row, David Hanley stood abruptly and left, his entourage scrambling to follow. Backstage, my team erupted in celebration. The federal contract was our biggest win yet, validation that we weren't just disrupting markets, we were defining them. My phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, partnership offers, interview requests. But the one that mattered most was from an unknown number. Watched your keynote from my office. You were right. I wasn't executive material either. Just submitted my resignation to Sterling. Linda. Linda, the CFO who delivered Sterling's verdict on my potential, had finally seen the cage they'd built for her, too. The war wasn't over. Sterling would regroup, attempt to compete, maybe even try more aggressive tactics. But standing there in Phoenix, surrounded by my team and the future we'd built from their scraps, I knew we'd already won the only battle that mattered. We'd prove them wrong by proving ourselves right. The Forbes photographer wanted me posed against the Denver skyline, Sterling's glass tower visible in the background. The symbolism was too heavy-handed for my taste. I'll pass, I told their editorial team. If you want a cover story, it's about TerraCore's future, not Sterling's past. They compromised with a shot in our operations center, surrounded by the real-time displays of our growing network. The headline would read, "The Rejection That Built a Billion-Dollar Empire." But I'd negotiated editorial control. The story would focus on our innovations, not their failures. Malik knocked on my office door the morning the article went live. Securities and Exchange Commission on line 1, something about an investigation into Sterling's market manipulation practices. I wasn't surprised. When giants fall, they rarely go quietly. Sterling had tried everything, patent challenges, predatory pricing, even attempting to poach our entire engineering team with golden handcuffs. Each desperate move only accelerated their decline. Tell them I'm happy to cooperate, I said. Full transparency. TerraCore had nothing to hide. Every contract was won fairly, every innovation developed in-house, Every success earned through execution, not exploitation. The same couldn't be said for Sterling's increasingly frantic attempts to stem their losses. The industry newsletters that week painted a clear picture. Sterling's stock had dropped 40% year over year. 3 major contracts canceled. Evan Rusk quietly resigned to pursue other opportunities. David Hanley announced he would step down as CEO by year's end, spinning it as a planned transition that fooled no one. Linda, Sterling's former CFO, had joined a renewable energy startup in Seattle. She sent me a message after her first week. They actually listened to ideas here. Revolutionary concept, right? I stood in our newest facility in Austin, watching Carmen's team install our 500th system. We'd expanded beyond the Southwest, with operations planned for the Midwest and negotiations beginning for our first international installations. Our workforce had grown to over 300 employees, with a waiting list of applicants that read like a who's who of undervalued talent from across the industry. "You know what's funny?" Jade said, joining me on the observation deck. "Sterling just posted a job listing for a director of distributed energy innovation. They're trying to build a department to compete with our entire company." "Let them," I replied. "They still don't understand that innovation isn't a department, it's a culture." The Forbes interview had asked me about revenge, about whether building TerraCore was my way of getting back at Sterling. I thought carefully about my answer. "Revenge implies I built this to hurt them," I'd said. "I didn't. I built this because they told me it couldn't be done. Their destruction is just a byproduct of their own blindness." But standing there, watching my team revolutionize an industry that had tried to revolutionize me out of existence, I admitted a quieter truth to myself. There was satisfaction in Sterling's struggle, not because I'd caused it, they'd done that themselves, but because it validated every sleepless night, every rejected proposal, every moment I doubted whether I was the problem. The final email from David Hanley arrived that afternoon. Personal account, not corporate, no lawyers, no formality. Just 3 lines. "You were right, I was wrong. Congratulations on everything you've built." I read it twice, then archived it without responding. Some conversations were better left closed. That evening, our entire team gathered for our quarterly celebration. No corporate speeches or forced team building, just good food, better company, and screens showing the real-time impact of our work. Thousands of businesses powered by our systems, millions of tons of carbon emissions prevented, hundreds of careers built on merit, not politics. Carmen raised a toast to being told we couldn't and proving we already had. The cheers that erupted weren't just celebration, they were vindication, shared by every person who'd ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they weren't executive material. As the party continued around me, I stepped outside onto the balcony. The Austin skyline glittered with possibility, each light representing potential energy, potential innovation, potential futures that wouldn't be limited by someone else's narrow vision. My phone buzzed with another interview request, another partnership offer, another opportunity to grow what we'd built. But for just a moment, I let myself simply stand there and breathe. They'd been right about one thing. All those years ago in Sterling's boardroom, I wasn't executive material. I wasn't meant to execute someone else's vision. I was meant to create something that made their vision obsolete. In the distance, construction lights marked the site of our next facility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that the best revenge isn't destroying those who doubted you. It's building something so undeniable that their doubt becomes irrelevant. They said I wasn't executive material. They were right. I was founder material all along. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Chloe's position? I read every comment and would love to hear your perspective.